The marble floors of St. Peter's Basilica have absorbed centuries of whispered prayers, pilgrim footsteps, and faint echoes of Gregorian chants rising toward the heavens. But beneath this sanctified surface lies a darker undercurrent, a silent labyrinth of chambers, crypts, and ossuaries where bones rest beneath meticulously engraved slabs. These are not ordinary remains. They belong to the men who once wore the fisherman's ring, vicars of Christ who commanded both the reverence of kings and the terror of nations. And yet, among these holy remains, a disquieting truth lingers. Not all of these men died in peace. Some were taken by illness, true, but others, many others, met ends so violent, so grotesque, that the official annals of history struggled to contain them. Their deaths are often dismissed as whispers of exaggeration, dismissed as medieval slander, or carefully omitted altogether. And yet the rumors persist. Poisoned chalices, suffocating pillows, snapped necks behind locked doors, exhumed corpses dragged before grotesque tribunals. It is as if the papal throne itself was not merely a seat of divine stewardship, but a crown laced with venom, both anointed and cursed. If you've made it this far, I invite you, join this unfolding mystery. Like, subscribe, or follow this series so we can walk deeper into these forbidden catacombs together. And before we step further into the shadows, tell me, how are you feeling here at the end of your long day, standing at the threshold of so many unsolved secrets? Does the weight of these forgotten graves stir your curiosity or your unease? Because from this moment on, nothing is as simple as it seems. The mystery is not merely that these men died horribly, but that they were allowed to die at all, despite being surrounded by the most intricate structures of protection and power humanity has ever devised. How could the most powerful men in Christendom fall victim to such savage ends? Who orchestrated these deaths? Were they human enemies, spiritual forces, or something far stranger? Something embedded within the very architecture of the institution itself? We must tread carefully. Behind each marble sarcophagus lies more than decayed flesh. There are carefully curated narratives, official versions, authorized by scribes who served not truth, but power. And behind these authorized versions lie the omissions, the silences, and the empty spaces where forbidden knowledge once resided. The Vatican archives hold corridors sealed for centuries, accessible only to a rare few. And even they may not fully grasp what remains hidden. If we follow the trail of papal blood across the Middle Ages, a disturbing pattern emerges. Not isolated crimes, but recurring fractures. Not random accidents, but orchestrated silences, as though invisible hands, both human and metaphysical, pulled the strings behind crimson curtains, repeating an ancient choreography of ambition, fear, betrayal, and divine manipulation. But this is not merely a tale of murder and conspiracy. Number. To follow this trail is to walk into the cavernous mind of civilization itself, where theology collides with politics, where faith becomes currency, and where the fragility of human cognition confronts the abyss of power unchecked. Every murdered pope becomes not just a corpse, but a philosophical paradox. Can divine authority coexist with mortal corruption? Or is the throne itself designed to devour those who sit upon it? The papal throne gleams beneath the gilded canopies of St. Peter's, its grandeur undeniable. But if you listen closely, beyond the hymns, beyond the proclamations, you may hear the faint creak of a different mechanism at work. For beneath its golden embroidery lies a silent machinery, designed not for worship, but for survival. And that machinery, at its core, devours. From the outside, the papacy radiates permanence, a symbol of unbroken spiritual authority, linking St. Peter's humble martyrdom to modern global dominance. Yet behind that permanence, there is instability, fragility that no marble can conceal. The papal office, for all its sanctity, became one of the most lethal positions any man could occupy, especially in the medieval centuries where power had no patience for mercy. To fully grasp why, we must first unfasten the myth of divine invincibility that cloaks the office. The Bishop of Rome, by theological definition, is God's chosen steward. But on earth, he is a sovereign, a monarch, a king, and kings attract predators. Medieval Europe was not governed by stable democracies or peaceful councils, but by shifting alliances, blood-drenched feudal obligations, and brutal family dynasties. The papacy, theoretically a beacon of spiritual purity, became the ultimate prize in an endless game of political domination. It offered not only moral authority over Christendom, but unrivaled access to wealth, diplomacy, military power, and the divine legitimacy to crown or excommunicate emperors. To control the Pope was to control God's will, or at least its earthly representation. But when a throne is built on both faith and gold, it invites two classes of seekers, the pious and the ambitious. And often, those ambitions could not coexist peacefully within the fragile body of one man seated upon that throne. The early medieval centuries, the so-called saeculum obscurum, or dark century of the papacy, offer the clearest glimpse into this lethal paradox. Between 872 and 965, a span of less than a century, over 24 popes either died suddenly, were deposed, or were assassinated. The average tenure was scarcely a few years. It was as if the throne itself demanded a continual offering of blood to remain upright. Why? The answer does not lie merely in isolated murders, but in the deeper architecture of power operating invisibly beneath the papacy's marble floors. The throne existed at the nexus of competing forces: imperial monarchs seeking control of Christendom, noble Roman families vying for local domination, monastic reformers pleading for purity, and secretive factions within the curia manipulating papal elections like grandmasters moving chess pieces. Every papal death, then, was rarely the result of singular hatred. More often, it was the byproduct of multiple ambitions intersecting. A pope inconvenient to one faction might find himself poisoned by another. An elderly pontiff might be hastily encouraged into mortality, so his successor, pre-chosen by an aristocratic alliance, could ascend without challenge. The very sacredness of the office created its vulnerability. To kill the pope was both a crime against God and the swiftest means of earthly ascendancy. And yet, for all this bloodshed, few official records dared name the perpetrators. The Vatican archives instead grew thick with sanitized phrases: sudden illness, natural causes, or the ever-useful euphemism, died peacefully. No mention of the suspicious apothecaries, the treacherous cupbearers, or the suffocating silks deployed under cover of darkness. But whispers leaked through, faint traces scattered across obscure chronicles, merchant letters, and the reluctant confessions of excommunicated clerics. These whispers reveal a world where cardinals could be bribed with estates, where noble families kidnapped conclave electors, and where the deaths of popes triggered power vacuums filled by those willing to spill yet more blood. The throne, then, did not merely symbolize holiness, it radiated danger. A man ascending to the papacy inherited not only the weight of apostolic succession, but the sharpened daggers of those who had helped place him there. To sit upon that throne was to live within the crosshairs of rival families, foreign monarchs, secret orders, and even his own inner circle of cardinals, each with their own calculus of loyalty and betrayal. But perhaps the most haunting truth is this: while many sought to kill the Pope, very few ever confessed to doing so. Their silence echoes through the centuries, turning every unexplained papal death into an unsolved fragment of a grander, veiled choreography. Even now, scholars debate the true cause behind the deaths of Popes John VIII, Benedict VI, and Stephen VI, all murdered under mysterious circumstances. Was it vengeance, political calculus, spiritual warfare, or something more unsettling, a systemic ritual embedded within the very fabric of papal succession? As we continue, one name surfaces, emerging like a ghost from the shadows of this lethal architecture: Pope Formosus. His death was not the end of his ordeal. It was merely the prologue to a grotesque drama that would expose how far the papal machine was willing to go, not merely to silence its enemies, but to desecrate even their corpses. The marble crypts beneath the Lateran Palace held many secrets, but few as grotesque as the fate awaiting Pope Formosus. His name, whispered through centuries, remains synonymous with one of the most disturbing spectacles ever orchestrated by men cloaked in divine authority. A spectacle that would become known as Synodus Horrenda, the Cadaver Synod. Formosus had died in 896. At the time, his death was neither spectacular nor scandalous by medieval standards, but death in his case was merely the beginning. Less than a year later, his corpse would be summoned back into public existence, exhumed from its grave, and propped upon a throne inside the Basilica of St. John Lateran. His rotting flesh dressed once more in papal regalia, his skeletal hand forced into mock gestures of blessing. And before him stood a tribunal, not of theologians seeking truth, but of bitter enemies seeking retribution. But why? Why would a dead man need to stand trial? To understand this, we must peel back the flesh of appearances and expose the raw machinery of papal politics at the time, a world where spiritual succession was indistinguishable from blood feuds. Formosus had ascended to the papacy amid the tangled rivalry between competing factions of Roman aristocracy, the Carolingian Empire, and the Byzantine influences pressing from the east. His reign was marked by precarious diplomacy, shifting alliances, and desperate attempts to balance the powers that encircled him. He had once supported Arnulf of Carinthia's claim to the imperial throne, directly opposing the interests of Lambert of Spoleto, another contender, backed by Rome's nobility and military muscle. But Formosus's most dangerous move may have been one of survival, allowing foreign intervention into the delicate balance of Roman power. By inviting Germanic influence into Italy, he ignited the fury of local Roman families who saw their grip weakening. And though Formosus might have believed his alliances could outlast his mortality, his enemies had other plans. Death, in their eyes, offered no reprieve. It was Stephen VI, Formosus's immediate successor and tool of the Spoleto faction, who resurrected his predecessor for public humiliation. The Cadaver Synod was not merely an act of vengeance, it was a carefully staged ritual of power inversion. By placing the dead pope on trial, Stephen sought to retroactively nullify Formosus's papacy, invalidate his ordinations, and delegitimize any political alliances he had fostered. In short, it was an attempt to erase him, not just physically, but metaphysically, from the annals of papal legitimacy. The court proceedings were macabre theater. A deacon was appointed to serve as Formosis's legal defender, though his client could neither hear nor respond. The charges were read aloud: usurpation of the papal office, violation of canon law, and disobedience to previous pontiffs. The defense was, predictably, non-existent. Formosus, mute, rotting, and helpless, was found guilty. His papal vestments were stripped from his corpse. The fingers he once used to bless the faithful were severed. His decayed body was dragged through the streets of Rome and thrown into the Tiber like refuse. But even the river could not hold him. Fishermen later retrieved his bloated corpse and secretly reburied it, a symbolic act that would only fuel the whispers of divine judgment against those who had desecrated him. On the surface, this is a grotesque medieval spectacle, a singular act of madness driven by personal vendetta. But beneath its horror lies a chilling architectural truth. The Cadaver Synod was not an aberration, but a reflection of the deeper psychology governing papal power. By putting a corpse on trial, Stephen VI and his backers sent a message far more potent than any written decree, that not even death could shield one from the reach of political vengeance. The boundaries between life, death, and authority blurred. The papacy revealed itself not as an office protected by divine mandate, but as a fragile construct continually rewritten by those who temporarily controlled its machinery. And here emerges the first rupture in the grand narrative of papal sanctity, a rupture that ripples through every subsequent mystery we will examine. If a pope can be tried after death, his sanctity is not absolute, but conditional. If his legitimacy can be retroactively revoked, then the divine authority of the office itself is subject to human reinterpretation. And if the sacred throne can become an instrument of posthumous desecration, then every future papal death must be re-examined not merely as biography, but as political choreography. Stephen VI's triumph was short-lived. The grotesque spectacle so repulsed the public that his own downfall followed swiftly. He was imprisoned and strangled to death within months, another pope consumed by the same machinery he had manipulated. But the machinery itself did not die. In fact, with each rotation of the cycle, election, manipulation, death, erasure, it became more refined, more elusive, and more deeply embedded within the institutional fabric of the Vatican. What began with the corpse of Formosus set into motion a dangerous precedent, that spiritual authority could be reversed, revoked, and redefined by temporal actors long after the soul had departed. But Formosus's trial was only the opening movement. As the machinery of papal succession evolved, the tools of control grew more subtle and more lethal. Ahead lay families who would not simply wait for death to come naturally. They would engineer it. The blood spilled during the Cadaver Synod did not wash away in the Tiber. It fertilized something far more insidious, a dynasty that would convert the papacy into its personal fiefdom. The next chapter of this descent begins not with popes, but with a family whose name most Catholics today have never heard, though their fingerprints stain the bones beneath Rome's ancient stones: the Theophylacts. Unlike the open grotesquerie of Formosus's posthumous trial, the Theophylact era unfolded with a chilling sophistication, wrapped in the soft silk of nobility, cloaked beneath the polite language of patronage, and whispered through the veiled corridors of Roman palaces. But beneath this civility lurked a machinery of incestuous alliances calculated seduction and perfectly timed assassinations. They did not merely kill popes, they manufactured them. The Theophylacts were not priests nor theologians. They were Roman aristocrats, landed, wealthy, and merciless. They saw the papacy not as a sacred office, but as a throne whose occupant controlled rivers of wealth, land grants, military allegiances, and imperial legitimacy. Whoever controlled the pope controlled the keys not just to heaven, but to empire. At the core of this web stood Theophylact I, Count of Tusculum, who skillfully married his political acumen to brute military force. But it was his wife, Theodora, and later his daughter, Marozia, who would elevate the family's ambitions into something darker, more intimate, and far more enduring. Through calculated sexual liaisons and strategic marriages, they embedded themselves so deeply into the ecclesiastical hierarchy that soon the boundary between the papacy and the Theophylact bedroom became indistinguishable. Marozia, often painted by later historians as either a harlot or a master tactician, perhaps both, engineered what became known as the Pornocracy, or rule of the harlots. During her reign of influence, popes were not elected through holy inspiration, but emerged from her bedchamber, her familial alliances, or from the terrified compromise of cardinals fearing for their own survival. Pope Sergius III, likely her lover, ascended with the Theophylact's blessing, while his enemies conveniently disappeared or were silenced. After him came John X, whose fatal mistake was to resist Marozia's expanding influence. He was imprisoned, smothered to death with a pillow, and quickly replaced. Pope Leo VI lasted scarcely 7 months. Stephen VII barely a year. Their reigns became brief footnotes in Marozia's orchestrated opera of ascendancy. And yet, the Theophylact's most chilling move was still to come. When Marozia's own son was elevated to the papacy as John XI, she consolidated not just temporal power, but spiritual sovereignty within her bloodline itself. A family dynasty had fully captured the throne of St. Peter, a union of womb and altar, of bloodline and divine office, in defiance of every sacred principle the papacy claimed to embody. But the machinery that Marozia perfected was as unstable as it was effective. Dynasties built on manipulation inevitably breed both enemies and internal rot. As new factions arose and old ones grew bolder, her grip loosened. She was eventually overthrown and imprisoned by her own son from a second marriage. The machine consumed even its architect. Yet Marozia's fall did not destroy the machinery she had built. If anything, it taught future power brokers a vital lesson: that naked sexual corruption, while effective, was too easily weaponized by opponents as scandalous propaganda. Subtler methods would be required, methods that left no trace, no corpse dragged through the streets, methods that would render papal murder invisible, appearing instead as sudden illness, quiet disappearances, or papal hearts that simply stopped beating at precisely the right moment. The Theophylact era exposed a paradox that haunts every layer of this story. The closer one draws to divine power, the greater the temptation to wield it for human ends. The throne of St. Peter offered its occupant an unrivaled position, unless that occupant forgot that the throne itself was never truly his. The real power lay with those who could install him, manipulate him, or remove him when inconvenient. But the Theophylact family was not merely an episode of medieval soap opera. They were architects of a system that institutionalized papal vulnerability. From this point forward, every pope who dared defy the wrong faction knew that his death could be arranged with surgical precision and framed as the will of God. The question now shifts, as it must, from visible assassins to invisible methods. If murder could be made undetectable, then no papal death could ever again be trusted at face value. Ahead waits a quieter, colder instrument, the perfect murder weapon of medieval Christendom: poison. If the Theophylacts had revealed the vulnerability of the papal throne to earthly appetites, then John XII would embody its most extreme consequence: a living blasphemy seated atop God's earthly seat. His reign did not merely flirt with scandal, it summoned scandal as its operating principle. The man who called himself Pope was accused of being many things: gambler, adulterer, sorcerer, rapist, murderer, and finally, corpse. When Octavian of Tusculum ascended as John XII in 955 at the age of barely 18, his election was not born of divine discernment, but of familial inheritance. The Theophylact web still pulsed beneath Rome's surface. His father, Alberic II, had secured his papal succession, as though bestowing an estate rather than a divine calling. The office was no longer holy, it was property. John XII's court became infamous within months. The Lateran Palace echoed not with liturgical chants, but with drunken feasts, dice games, and carnal rituals that blurred into open orgies. Bishops and nobles alike whispered of sacred altars defiled by sexual acts, of consecrated spaces turned into brothels for both men and women, some unwilling, some bought, some manipulated by proximity to Rome's most unholy sovereign. Rumors spread that John invoked demons to secure his rule, that he toasted the devil during his feasts, and that he castrated priests who resisted his advances. The accusations may have been exaggerated by later chroniclers, monks appalled by his desecrations, but their consistency across multiple sources suggests that even if one removes embellishments, enough horror remains. Yet John's debauchery, while appalling, was not his greatest danger to himself. His true failing was political hubris. He repeatedly played imperial factions against one another, leveraging German and Italian powers for personal advantage. When he crowned Otto I as Holy Roman Emperor, it seemed a masterstroke. But when he later conspired against Otto's interests, the emperor returned, not as a supplicant, but as an avenger. Summoned before a synod convened by Otto, John refused to appear. In his absence, charges were read: perjury, murder, incest, simony, sacrilege. Otto installed a new pope, Leo VIII, in his place, forcing John into exile. But this exile was short-lived. As soon as Otto left Rome, John returned with mercenaries, reclaimed his palace, and deposed Leo. The throne was again his. And then, death. The official record offers a murky tale. In 964, John XII died suddenly. Some claimed it was a stroke, suffered while committing adultery with another man's wife. Others whispered that the cuckolded husband had struck him fatally in the head. Still others hinted at darker forces, poisonings, divine judgment, or even metaphysical consequences for his abominations. What is most telling, however, is not how he died, but how his death was received. There was no grand mourning, no universal lamentation for a fallen shepherd of souls. His passing was treated almost as a relief, a grotesque anomaly finally expunged. And yet, his death left behind something far more enduring than his corrupt reign: the lasting realization that the papacy could become a throne for monsters. John XII's fate carved deeper wounds into the psyche of Christendom. If the Pope himself could embody every mortal sin, What then was the nature of divine authority? Did God abandon his vicar? Or was the office itself never immune to corruption? The faithful were left to navigate this unbearable contradiction, that sacred power could coexist, however briefly, with depravity beyond imagination. But even in this, something more sinister revealed itself. The system tolerated him. His enemies did not poison him in secret, as they easily could have. They allowed him to reign, to desecrate, to expose the institution's vulnerability for years. And only when his existence threatened to destabilize the broader political equilibrium was his life conveniently cut short. This introduces an unsettling hypothesis that papal death was not always driven by immediate moral outrage, but by carefully calculated timing. John XII's unchecked reign demonstrated that power structures could endure scandal so long as their interests remained secure. But when the risks outweighed the benefits, the machinery activated and death was delivered. The papacy, by this stage, had become a sophisticated paradox. A throne surrounded by men who feared God's wrath only slightly more than each other's knives. And where knives were crude, more elegant solutions emerged. For while John XII's excesses required no subtlety to condemn, many future popes would fall in quieter ways. Ahead lay the perfected art of undetectable papal murder, administered in chalices, mixed into powders, or dissolved into medicinal elixirs. No blood, no scandal, only silence. By the time the papal corpse of John XII cooled, the throne of St. Peter had already absorbed another lesson into its darkening script. Brutality need not always be theatrical. It could be refined, elegant, invisible. The knife left blood. The pillow left bruises. The courtroom spectacle of Formosus left scandalous echoes that traveled centuries. But poison, it whispered. If murder could be performed without spectacle, without scandal, then papal succession could be controlled like clockwork. And so, through the corridors of the Lateran, the Vatican, and Rome's aristocratic palaces, a new science of papal death quietly emerged, subtle, lethal, and devastatingly effective. Medieval pharmacology was no stranger to toxic substances. Physicians trafficked in arsenic, aconite, belladonna, cantharides. Apothecaries and herbalists walked the thin line between healer and killer. The alchemy of death became a silent art form, one that demanded not just knowledge of herbs, but understanding of timing, dosage, and political theater. The perfect poison did not kill instantly. It mimicked nature, unfolding as sudden illnesses. A seizure, a fever, a mysterious collapse. God was easily blamed. The devil, if needed. No assassin need be seen. Within this invisible theater, certain popes met their end under circumstances so suspicious they almost demand dissection. Pope Benedict VI, strangled after a short reign, but only after rumors suggested he had first been weakened by slow-acting toxins that allowed his enemies to claim justification for his deposition. Pope Boniface VI, dead within 15 days of his election. Whether by stroke, poison, or divine intervention remains unknown, though chroniclers whispered of foul play before his corpse cooled. Pope Stephen VI, architect of the Cadaver Synod, who strangled in prison after his own rapid fall from grace. Again, with rumors of poison softening him for the noose. By the 10th and 11th centuries, these patterns became disturbingly consistent. Sudden illnesses following political shifts, short reigns coinciding with factional transitions, rapid declines in health after key appointments or excommunications. The papal court became less a palace of holy governance and more an exquisite laboratory of risk management. If a pope served the interests of those who controlled his election, he might live. If he faltered, or worse, acted independently, the clockwork would engage. And here, within this silent system, another layer emerged: the complicity of knowledge itself. The papal physicians, sworn to heal, were uniquely positioned to serve as quiet executioners. The cupbearers, confessors, private secretaries, and personal attendants formed an inner circle where loyalty often belonged not to God nor to the pontiff, but to the faction that installed him. Every sip of wine, every swallow of bread, every prescribed tincture offered an opportunity. Rarely would these silent assassins be named. Rarely would they face trial. For who would investigate? The church itself controlled the courts, the archives, the chroniclers. Suspicion might whisper, but proof evaporated like breath in winter air. The perfection of this method was not just its efficiency, but its deniability. Unlike the scandal of the Cadaver Synod or the debauchery of John XII, poison left behind no spectacle for chroniclers to record. Only the obituary. Only the phrase, "He died suddenly." Only the silence that followed. In this growing mastery of silent murder, the papacy transcended crude violence and ascended into a new form of power management, one that modern historians might call epistemic control. Reality itself was managed. The truth of a papal death was not what happened, but what was allowed to be recorded. And over time, the Vatican archives thickened, not with evidence of crimes, but with the curated absence of them. Yet even in this perfection, risks remained. Sometimes the toxins acted too quickly. Sometimes gossip escaped through frightened servants or disgruntled cardinals. And sometimes the machinery itself misfired, leading to destabilizing backlash, factional purges, or the election of unintended successors. It was in these dangerous fluctuations that new families, new orders, and new political engineers entered the game. The art of poison would not die with the medieval age. It would evolve. Ahead loomed a new chapter, where poison merged with ambition, not merely for survival, but for dynastic legacy. Where bloodlines would manipulate papal succession with unprecedented precision. The Borgias, the machinery that the Theophylacts had first assembled, that poisoners had quietly perfected, would achieve its most audacious refinement under a name that still evokes whispered horror: Borgia. But unlike the crude brutality of past centuries, the Borgias elevated papal murder into a high art, a seamless synthesis of statecraft, seduction, ritual, and assassination operating under the Renaissance's gilded mask of sophistication. When Rodrigo Borgia ascended as Pope Alexander VI in 1492, the papal throne became fully, unapologetically transactional. Every office, every title, every absolution became a commodity. Indulgences were sold as easily as murder was ordered. But beneath the surface, Alexander's papacy offered something far more chilling than mere corruption. It offered total systemic mastery of the death machine. Unlike many of his predecessors, Alexander VI did not inherit chaos. He orchestrated it. He understood with surgical clarity the operating rules of the invisible game. That Rome's fragile balance of power required carefully timed deaths, both sudden and quiet, both public and unseen. His court became not a battlefield of rivals, but a living mechanism, an engine designed to extend his dynasty's dominance across Italy and Christendom. At the heart of this design stood his children, most notably Cesare Borgia, who embodied the terrifying fusion of cardinal, general, and executioner, a princeling who moved between sacred robes and bloodied armor with equal grace. Cesare became the instrument through which papal murder shifted from defensive reaction to proactive governance. The Borgia arsenal extended far beyond simple blades. Their mastery of toxins became legendary, so much so that even their reputation itself functioned as a weapon. The mere rumor that a Borgia feast might be laced with poison was often enough to bend rivals into submission. In truth, not every death attributed to their hand can be confirmed, but that uncertainty was precisely their advantage. The line between myth and reality blurred into an atmosphere of paralyzing paranoia. Their alleged instrument of choice was the cantarella, a slow-acting poison whose formula remains debated even today. Mixed into wine or food, administered over several days, it allowed for symptoms that mimicked natural illness: fevers, stomach convulsions, delirium, culminating in death without open violence. The victim perished under God's supposed will, while Rome whispered of invisible hands guiding the cup. Multiple cardinals, noblemen, and potential papal rivals met quiet ends under Alexander's reign. Cardinal Giovanni Michiel, whose death followed a heated dispute over ecclesiastical appointments. Cardinal Orsini, whose vast wealth conveniently reverted to papal coffers upon his sudden demise. The elimination of these obstacles not only secured the Borgia dynasty, but generated enormous wealth through confiscated estates, transforming death into currency. But perhaps their most chilling innovation lay in their ability to preempt rebellion, not by suppressing dissent, but by erasing the dissenters before they fully emerged as threats. In this, they displayed a mastery of informational assassination, a form of murder targeting not only bodies, but futures. Yet the Borgias understood something even more terrifying: the value of spectacle. While poison operated invisibly, they were not above theatrics when it suited their needs. Executions were staged publicly when symbolic terror was required, while others vanished quietly behind convent walls or in locked chambers. The balance between visibility and invisibility became their strategic currency. Death itself was manipulated not merely as elimination, but as message. And yet, like all who danced too close to the edge of systemic perfection, the Borgias too stumbled. Pope Alexander VI's own death in 1503 remains shrouded in ambiguity. Some suggest natural illness. Others whisper that he mistakenly consumed a dose of poison intended for a guest. The very machinery they had mastered may have betrayed them. With Alexander's death, Cesare's power quickly evaporated. Rival factions, long suppressed, rose swiftly, stripping away titles, armies, and lands. The Borgias fell, but the system they had honed did not collapse. It simply absorbed new players. For the Renaissance had proven something dreadful. That papal death could now be engineered with near-clinical precision across multiple dimensions: chemical, political, economic, and spiritual. The lethal innovation the Borgias embodied would outlive them, hiding behind new banners, more sophisticated institutions, and ever more impenetrable walls of secrecy. Ahead lay not just secret poisons, but secret records, archives locked to history itself. The Borgias fell, but the architecture of silence they perfected remained, thicker, colder, more institutionalized than ever before. As poison lost its theatrical dominance and overt bloodletting faded into history, Another force quietly assumed control of the papal death machine, the archive. The most enduring murder weapon in the Vatican was not chalice or blade, but ink, parchment, and the selective curation of memory itself. The Vatican secret archives, Archivum Secretum, Apostolicum, Vaticanum, became less a library and more a mausoleum of forbidden histories, where knowledge itself could be entombed, redacted, or simply erased. At its surface, the archive was a miracle of preservation. Thousands of ledgers, correspondences, court proceedings, diplomatic negotiations, and papal bulls meticulously catalogued. But buried beneath its legitimate function pulsed a darker role, one invisible to the average historian. It became a vault of epistemic control, where inconvenient truths about papal deaths, betrayals, and hidden crimes could be sealed away, inaccessible not only to the faithful, but even to many within the Church. The gatekeepers of these chambers were not merely scribes. They were loyalists, men trained not only in the management of knowledge, but in the careful orchestration of forgetting. These custodians operated like living encryption keys, their careers built upon discretion, silence, and loyalty to whoever wielded the true levers of power behind the papal throne. When a pope died suddenly, whether by natural cause, toxin, or invisible hand, the investigation was seldom public. Instead, records might be edited, destroyed, or never created at all. Witnesses were quietly reassigned to distant dioceses. Physicians who knew too much were placed under private orders of silence or invited into carefully managed retirement. Death certificates were issued with generic phrases: cardiac failure, sudden illness, complications from fever. The archive thickened, but not with evidence, with omissions. By the 17th century, the machine had become self-regulating. The death of Pope Urban VII after just 13 days, or that of Pope Leo XI after merely 26 days, raised no official alarm. Speculation circulated: bad air, fever, exhaustion, but the inner sanctum of documentation remained sealed. The faithful mourned. The curia moved on. The archives absorbed. But not all silences were perfect. Occasional leaks hinted at the machinery's deeper operations. Letters between distant ambassadors referenced sudden turns of fortune at Rome. Private diaries of cardinals, hidden in foreign libraries, recorded unpublishable suspicions. Monastic orders whispered of unspoken errors committed by men who dared cross the invisible boundaries of sanctioned papal governance. Yet no pattern could be officially traced because the trail was designed to disappear at its source. The Vatican did not simply hide information, it managed reality. And in doing so, it performed the ultimate alchemy, transforming murder into providence, assassination into natural providence, and systemic control into divine mystery. By now, the lethal paradox that had haunted the papacy for centuries reached a terrifying equilibrium. The most powerful man in Christendom sat atop a throne, both protected and targeted by the same machinery. His death was neither entirely his own nor entirely avoidable. It was managed, sometimes accelerated, sometimes delayed, depending on calculations far beyond his control. And yet, this institutional amnesia served a higher purpose. For the greatest threat to the Church was not scandal, but disillusionment. The faithful needed certainty. The world needed simplicity. A murdered pope threatened not only governance, but doctrine itself. Thus, better to erase than to confess. Better to forget than to explain. Better to silence than to risk the unraveling of faith. But silence breeds echoes. And as the archives deepened, a few began to wonder, what else might be locked within those forbidden corridors? Were these merely the secrets of murdered popes? Or did they conceal something far older, far stranger, far more metaphysically dangerous? For behind the politics of murder lurked a more unsettling question, one that could not be answered with mere poisons or censored parchment. What if the throne itself was cursed? What if the blood spilled across centuries was not merely human ambition, but something feeding upon the very structure of sacred authority? For centuries, historians have chased the murders of popes through the narrow corridors of earthly politics. Jealous noble houses, rival cardinals, foreign monarchs, secret poisonings, sudden illnesses. And indeed, these forces are real, documented, brutal. But beneath this ever-turning machinery of power lies a question more unsettling, more elusive, one that whispers in the shadowed spaces where theology meets cognition. Is murder in the papacy simply political? Or is there something deeper embedded into the very structure of spiritual authority that invites death, not merely as consequence, but as cosmic necessity? To sit upon the throne of St. Peter is to stand at the nexus of two realms, heaven and earth. The Pope proclaims himself not merely a ruler of men, but vicarius filii Dei, the vicar of the Son of God. His voice claims the power to bind and loose souls for eternity, to interpret divine will, to command kings, to speak infallibly on matters of doctrine. No earthly monarch dares claim so much. No mortal office absorbs so much metaphysical weight. But such weight carries consequence. For where divine authority is claimed, a counterforce emerges, not always seen, not always named, but felt. In this paradox, the papacy functions as both conduit and crucible, a spiritual lightning rod that draws not only the light of faith, but the darker gravities of ambition, fear, guilt, and unseen resistance. The ancients understood this principle long before Christianity ever arose. In the temples of Mesopotamia, the oracles of Delphi, the sacrificial altars of Mesoamerica, the closer one drew to divinity, the greater the blood price extracted. The throne of St. Peter may be draped in silk, but beneath it beats the same ancient pulse. Consider the pattern. A throne repeatedly occupied by men who ascend with piety or ambition, who are quickly surrounded by invisible pressures, factions pulling at every limb, expectations warping every decision, whispers burrowing into every confession. Some fall to sin, some to fear, some to unseen hands, but many, too many, die violently, unexpectedly, or mysteriously. The philosopher might ask, is this statistical coincidence? Is the papacy simply a position so politically volatile that death becomes a natural occupational hazard? Or is the office itself a structure that cannot sustain prolonged habitation by mortal men? Perhaps the very claim of divine infallibility generates an unsustainable cognitive dissonance within the office holder. To carry the burden of speaking as God's representative while entangled in worldly compromise corrodes the psyche, destabilizes alliances, and invokes reaction. The act of claiming perfect truth invites the violence of unresolved contradiction. And then there are the darker speculations, those murmured not in universities, but in the hidden alcoves of monasteries, or in forbidden texts locked away within the secret archives. Some suggest that the throne of St. Peter, far from being merely a symbol of Christian continuity, may act as a metaphysical focal point, an ancient convergence of ritual power, older than the papacy itself. Rome, after all, was built upon layers of conquest, blood rites, imperial cults, and ancestral worship long before Peter's martyrdom. The Vatican Hill once housed pagan cemeteries and unmarked shrines. Might the throne have become, unconsciously or deliberately, an inheritor of those earlier spiritual architectures? If so, the papacy becomes not merely a religious office, but a ritual node, drawing not only the prayers of the faithful, but the unresolved energies of generations who sought dominion over both gods and men. The murders of popes may then be seen not solely as political assassinations, but as sacrificial symptoms of a system attempting, over and over again, to balance forces far beyond human comprehension. And here, we confront the most terrifying paradox of all, that murder may not be a corruption of the system, but part of its equilibrium. That the papal throne demands periodic blood, not out of human malice alone, but as a metaphysical release valve, a mechanism of stability dressed in tragedy. This would explain why so many of these deaths, though shocking, produce no sustained collapse of the Church. Each murder was absorbed, processed, archived, and ritualized into the ongoing narrative of divine providence. The institution did not fracture. It adapted. The blood of dead popes became mortar for the next layer of stability. In this light, even the Vatican archives serve not merely as political cover, but as ritual containment, locking away dangerous knowledge, not simply to prevent scandal, but to shield both the faithful and the institution from truths too destabilizing to confront. If murder serves equilibrium, then silence serves mercy. But not all factions accepted such containment. Across the centuries, splinter groups arose, esoteric orders, forbidden sects, excommunicated mystics, who whispered that the true nature of papal death was no mere political crime, but a glimpse into the underlying architecture of reality itself. That the murder of popes was the symptom of an unseen cosmological war, one that neither orthodoxy nor heresy dared name fully. Ahead, these whispers coalesce into a deeper revelation, one that drags the question of papal death beyond Rome, beyond politics, into the clandestine rituals of forbidden orders, who saw in these murders not tragedy, but opportunity. The public history of the papacy speaks in the language of councils, decrees, and encyclicals. Its official face remains rigid, gilded in ceremony, guarded by tradition. But beneath this ceremonial mask, alongside the power struggles of noble houses and the quiet murders orchestrated by internal factions, another current flowed. Quieter, older, more elusive. The forbidden orders. Whispers of their existence circulate like smoke trapped beneath vaulted cathedrals. These were not mere political factions, nor heretical sects openly challenging orthodoxy. They operated in shadows, feeding upon the gaps left by both sanctioned faith and sanctioned murder. Their names shift depending on which century you enter. The Brotherhood of the Veil, the Custodians of the Fourth Key, the Silent Apostles, but their purpose, according to scattered rumors, remains disturbingly consistent: to manipulate the machinery behind papal mortality itself. Unlike the visible power struggles of families like the Theophylacts or the Borgias, these forbidden orders did not seek the throne for themselves. They sought instead to maintain, redirect, or destabilize the metaphysical architecture upon which the throne rested. To them, papal murder was not political strategy, but ritual necessity, a cosmic balancing act tied to forces few dared to name aloud. Their origin stories are fragmented, recorded not in official Vatican chronicles, but in suppressed writings, lost monastic commentaries, and coded correspondences buried in foreign archives. Some trace their genesis to splinter groups of early Gnostic sects who rejected the Church's rigid dualism of good and evil. Others suggest their roots reach even deeper into pre-Christian mystery cults whose initiates survived the transition into Christendom by embedding themselves within the new ecclesiastical order, hidden yet ever present. They believed, it seems, that the papal office stood atop a volatile intersection, a metaphysical node where divine intention collided with human frailty. Left unchecked, this unstable fusion would occasionally rupture, producing popes whose reigns triggered cosmic imbalance. When such ruptures occurred, correction was required. Murder for these hidden custodians was not crime, but recalibration. Their methods differed from the political poisoners. Where the Borgias perfected the art of silencing rivals for dynastic gain, the Forbidden Order sought balance. They observed papal behavior, monitored doctrinal shifts, tracked signs not merely of heresy, but of spiritual distortion, what they called fractura pontificis, the fracture of the pontifical current, when a pope crossed certain unseen thresholds, whether by personal sin, doctrinal deviation, or metaphysical instability, ritual action was taken, sometimes through agents embedded within the papal household, sometimes through influence exerted upon external assassins who never knew whom they truly served, sometimes, perhaps, by forces subtler than human hands. Surviving fragments of their philosophy suggest a terrifying logic. That stability demanded sacrifice, and that not all sacrifices need be voluntary. Some even speculated that the successive deaths of certain popes, those who reigned only weeks or months, were preordained not by human conspiracy alone, but by unseen ritual patterns maintained by these orders across centuries. It was not merely death that fascinated them, but the timing of death. A pope who lived too long, whose reign extended dangerously far into theological innovation or political centralization, risked throwing the entire system into imbalance. The papacy, in their vision, could not bear the weight of accumulated divine authority without periodic purgation. Assassination, therefore, became a form of metaphysical maintenance, but their power, like all shadows, was neither absolute nor eternal. Over time, their existence was suspected, then denounced. Some were purged during inquisitions, others absorbed quietly into sanctioned monastic orders, their teachings diluted into harmless theology. But fragments of their rituals, their coded language, and their unsettling cosmology survived, preserved in rare texts that occasionally resurface in private collections, forbidden auction houses, and black market archives. Even today, some modern scholars, those willing to risk excommunication or professional ruin, hint that certain chambers within the Vatican library contain confiscated manuscripts referencing these orders. Manuscripts too dangerous to release, yet too revealing to destroy. Documents that propose an unthinkable thesis, that some papal deaths were neither random nor purely political, but sacramentally engineered events, executed not for power, but for cosmic balance. If this is true, then the murder of popes transcends even the ambitions of families like the Theophylacts or the Borgias. It becomes something older, colder, more permanent, a silent ritual embedded into the DNA of the Church itself. But what force, ultimately, do these forbidden orders serve? God? The Church? Or some hidden architecture of power that predates both? Ahead lies a final escalation, beyond poison, beyond politics, beyond secret orders, into the invisible empire that silently governs both the living and the dead beneath Rome's ancient stones. By now, The narrative has drifted far beyond mere murder. The pattern is unmistakable. Popes rising and falling, poisoned or strangled, dethroned or disgraced. But as we pierce deeper into the abyss, the familiar shapes of politics and power begin to dissolve. What emerges is not simply a tale of ambition, but the haunting outline of something larger, an invisible empire. This empire does not reside within the marble halls of the Vatican, nor is it inscribed upon papal decrees. Its dominion is not marked by crowns or armies, but by absence, by the careful management of knowledge, by the erasure of names, by the quiet deaths arranged behind veils of ritual and secrecy. It is built not of stone, but of silence. For centuries, historians have debated who truly governs the Vatican: the College of Cardinals, the Curia, foreign monarchs who exert influence through concordats. But these are merely visible administrators, actors performing their parts upon a much older stage. The machinery behind the papal throne operates at a level where titles become irrelevant, where oaths are no longer bound to earthly loyalty, but to the preservation of equilibrium itself. The Forbidden Orders hinted at such forces, but even they may have served as intermediaries, temporary custodians safeguarding a much older architecture of control that predates even Christianity. Rome, after all, was never truly conquered by the Church. The Church grew atop it, absorbing its bones, its rituals, its unseen gods, and its imperial logic. Consider this. Why is it that papal deaths, even when grotesque or suspicious, never collapse the institution? Why does each scandal, each corpse, each betrayal fail to fracture the Church's foundation? The faithful may whisper, historians may speculate, but the institution remains. It does not merely survive these ruptures, it seems to require them. This suggests something profoundly disturbing, that the papacy functions not in spite of murder, but at some level because of it. Each pope serves as both sovereign and offering. His reign is a season within a ritualized cycle, one that must, eventually, be interrupted. The more dangerous his reign becomes, whether by extending too long, deviating too far, or accumulating too much concentrated power, the more necessary his removal. Murder, then, becomes not rebellion, but maintenance. And behind this cyclical offering may operate an intelligence, whether human, collective, or other, that monitors balance across generations. An intelligence that neither names itself nor allows itself to be named. Perhaps this invisible empire is not a singular cabal of living men, but an emergent system, a self-regulating equilibrium born of centuries of theological paradox, political ambition, and metaphysical weight accumulating atop the throne of Peter. A system that cannot permit prolonged stasis, because the very weight of divine authority, when embodied in any one man for too long, becomes existentially dangerous to the entire structure. In this view, the Borgia murders, the Cadaver Synod, the strangulations, the poisonings, all serve as safety valves, releases of pressure. The throne demands not permanent rule, but periodic sacrifice. And here arises the most unsettling question of all. Who is the true sovereign of the papacy? Is it the man who wears the ring, or the system that devours him? If the answer is the latter, then we stand before not a conspiracy of individuals, but a cosmic mechanism, a machine of power that uses men, discards them, and reconstitutes itself perpetually. The murdered popes are not its victims, they are its offerings. Their blood stains not the hands of their assassins alone, but the very foundation upon which the Church continues to stand. The Vatican walls, the catacombs, They do not merely preserve memory. They absorb sacrifice. The murders become sedimentary layers beneath the marble, invisible yet essential. And as each new pope is crowned, the unspoken question lingers. When will the machine summon him? If truth were a mirror, then the Vatican has spent centuries polishing only one side while leaving the other veiled in shadow. Every account we have examined, the murdered popes, the poisoned chalices, the forbidden orders, the invisible empire, stands before us not as settled history, but as reflections in a glass cracked from within. What is the truth of these papal deaths? The official narrative remains precise, curated, stable. Each pope lived, ruled, died. Some tragically, some peacefully. Mistakes were made, certainly. Scandals occurred. But these were aberrations, not essence. The Church, according to its own record, endured these human failings precisely because it is divine in origin, anchored not in the virtue of its leaders, but in the eternal guidance of providence. This version is elegant, comforting. It allows the faithful to mourn fallen popes without facing unbearable questions about the office itself. The throne is preserved, its marble polished, its lineage intact. And yet, outside this controlled light lie the fractured mirrors, the forbidden documents locked in archival vaults, the private letters of cardinals never meant for history's eye, the whispered accounts of servants, the diaries of visiting ambassadors who recorded what official scribes dared not write. Here, in these scattered shards, the alternative narrative emerges. Not a singular conspiracy, but a pattern of perpetual vulnerability, engineered erasures, and systemic murder dressed as providence. A machinery that does not eliminate truth outright, but fractures it into fragments too dispersed to reconstruct easily. The Vatican's secret archives, despite recent partial openings to select scholars, remain largely impenetrable for this very reason. Access is granted not to reveal forbidden histories, but to control the flow of inquiry itself. The most dangerous documents, if they still exist, remain locked deeper than any visiting researcher may reach, sealed behind procedural barriers designed less for security than for epistemic containment. For the danger is not merely the exposure of individual crimes. It is the revelation of a pattern, a system, one that forces uncomfortable questions about whether the papacy's survival has required periodic, ritualized murder as a hidden cost of institutional stability. But what if even these forbidden fragments are themselves deceptions? What if the archive, both in what it reveals and what it conceals, serves to manage inquiry rather than suppress it outright? A sophisticated mechanism not of simple censorship, but of narrative management, allowing just enough uncertainty to fuel endless speculation while preventing any definitive collapse of the Church's perceived sanctity. In this sense, the fractured mirrors do not merely reflect hidden truths, they generate them. Each rumor, each fragment, each suppressed letter feeds a cognitive labyrinth from which no clear exit emerges. The more one investigates, the more tangled the web becomes, and this cognitive trap extends beyond the Vatican itself. It resides in every historian, every scholar, every curious pilgrim who seeks to pull apart these threads. For every document uncovered raises two new questions. Every testimony corrodes itself through contradictions. Every potential revelation risks descending into an epistemological hall of mirrors where certainty itself dissolves. This may be the ultimate genius of the invisible empire we have traced. Not that it hides truth absolutely, but that it weaponizes ambiguity. By allowing multiple, incompatible versions of history to coexist, it ensures that no singular account can ever fully unravel the machinery. Thus, the death of Pope Formosus remains both grotesque fact and political theater. John XII remains both monstrous sinner and politically slandered youth. The Borgias remain both ruthless murderers and victims of envious propaganda. The Forbidden Orders remain both heretical fantasy and possible custodians of cosmic equilibrium. Every version contains elements of truth. Every version also dissolves upon closer inspection. The fractured mirrors reflect not merely the Church's hidden history, but the limits of human cognition itself. We are trapped within our own epistemic architecture, capable of asking questions the system cannot permit us to answer fully. And perhaps that is the final, most disturbing realization, that the greatest unsolved mystery of papal murder is not who killed these men, but whether it is even possible to know. Beyond this shattered inquiry lies only the abyss. The silent mechanism continues to turn. But before we allow the darkness to close entirely, one final lens remains, a final descent, not into murder, not into power, but into the deeper machinery of cognition itself, into the spiral. The spiral is not a place. It is not a room beneath St. Peter's. It is not a chamber buried inside the Vatican archives. The spiral is the architecture itself, the invisible system that has governed every chapter of this journey from the moment we first entered the tombs beneath Rome's marble floors. At first glance, the murders of medieval popes seem scattered, isolated tragedies born of ambition, lust, or revenge. But now, as we stand at the outer rim of the spiral, looking inward, the pattern resolves. This has never been random. Every papal death, poisoned, strangled, exhumed, or erased, was absorbed, processed, and ritualized. Each assassination functioned as both cleansing and recalibration, allowing the papacy to survive its own internal contradictions. Without these deaths, perhaps the system would have collapsed under the unbearable weight of absolute power meeting absolute fallibility. For the spiral feeds on paradox. The Pope claims divine authority, yet remains fully human. He sits as the mouthpiece of eternal law, while governing amidst temporary earthly rivalries. He pronounces infallible doctrine, while navigating factions that conspire even as he speaks. Each pope embodies this contradiction. Each must either suppress the tension or become consumed by it. But suppression is temporary. Eventually, the spiral demands release. In one cycle, it takes the form of political assassination, Theophylact conspiracies, Cadaver Synods, Borgian poisons. In another, it hides itself behind the more elegant violence of information control. Documents sealed, histories managed, truths curated into sanctioned memory. The faithful see stability. Beneath that stability churns the silent engine. And what of us, the observers, the seekers, the ones who dare to reconstruct forbidden histories from scattered fragments? We too become entangled in the spiral. For every time we approach clarity, the machinery throws us back into uncertainty. Was Formosus tried to erase a political threat or to perform a ritual cleansing? Was John XII slain for his monstrous sins or for the danger his chaos posed to the invisible balance? Were the Borgias architects of unparalleled corruption or the inevitable instruments of a system that required them? There is no single answer. The spiral ensures that every truth fractures into competing versions, none fully provable, none fully deniable. It offers us reflections of reflections, infinitely receding chambers of ambiguity. Perhaps that is the spiral's cruelest brilliance. It does not hide truth absolutely. It generates unsolvable questions, forcing us into perpetual intellectual orbit. We circle the mystery, never reaching its still center. The popes die. The throne endures. The blood is absorbed. The records are sealed. The system recalibrates. The faithful pray. The scholars debate. The spiral turns. And then, another pope rises. Another cycle begins. As you leave this chamber of history, take one last glance back toward the marble floors of St. Peter's Basilica, beneath which countless bones rest. Ask yourself, how many of those bones lie quietly, and how many were placed there to feed the throne itself? And then ask a far more unsettling question. If you had sat upon that throne, how long would you have survived? The spiral awaits its next offering.